your sensational hosts, Gilsey and Drusilla.
Hello.
Welcome to Moon Moment, the podcast where we discuss the Sailor Moon canon for what we affectionately call, you guessed it, Moon Moments.
Moments that we feel exemplify what Sailor Moon stands for and represents. Last time, we looked at the final episodes of the first season. Today, we're going to do something a little less devastating.
Yep. For our season finale, we have a special guest here to talk to us about all things anime and animation. John Maher is a journalist covering the book business for Publishers Weekly and animation for Vulture and elsewhere. He treats his anxiety with Animaniacs, his depression with Darkwing Duck, and his PTSD with Princess Mononoke.
Everyone welcome John Maher to Moon Moment. Yay!
Yay!
Hi, everybody. It's nice to be here with my two colleagues.
Colleagues? Excuse you.
I'm excused.
Colleagues.
We have a lot of topics to talk about with John today that refer back to a lot of questions that we had during this first season. But before we dive into all of that, we have a couple of really special shout-outs. First off, incredible, super amazing shout-out to listener Bradley, who gave us our first ever feedback. Yay!
Yes!
So
Drusilla literally texted me this, and I was super happy.
Fulfilled. Super fulfilled. You were super fulfilled.
Super fulfilled. Thank you so much. It means the world to us when people shout us out and give us little comments because we are both fangirls at heart.
And you can do so via the Contact Us page on our website or just adding us at Moon Moment Pod on Twitter. The other shout-out that we have, shout out to North America, which has 77% of our listeners. The U.S. is the front of the pack there, which, makes sense. 9% of our listeners are in Europe, with Germany at the forefront. And 6% from South America, with Brazil being the big dog there. Which isn't surprising, because I know that Brazil has a lot of Miraculous Ladybug fans, so I wonder if there's some sort of crossover there.
It's also got a pretty excellent animation industry itself, too.
So thank you to everyone who's listening. We hope you stick with us. Season 2 will be starting in November, so check us out then. But let's talk some anime and animation with our fabulous friend, John Maher.
Apparently we are just colleagues to John Maher, but whatever. It's fine.
Oh yeah, excuse me, colleagues.
Friendship is redacted.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, is this not some sort of professional situation here? I mean, I've even been told that I can't curse, so I'm assuming I was supposed to hype up the professional
That's already gone with your intro.
Good point.
I mean, there were definite tears in our last tears in our last episode. So, and so much squeeing in previous episodes. I feel like professionalism
flew the coop.
Yes, exactly.
Well, I'm here to put you back on task. I have really terrible news for both of you. And all of your listeners, which is that I am not going to cry at all. Not that I don't cry over animation a lot, because I do. But I am not going to answer all the questions you have, because there's absolutely no way that I'm going to be able to do that. And I have never watched Sailor Moon. So this is going to be a really fascinating conversation.
See, the reason why you're here is because you're a huge animation nerd, and what you know could kind of help cover what we don't know. Because we've definitely talked a lot about stuff like, what was prevalent in maybe 90s animation, or like feminism in anime in the 90s. And it's not just anime that we were talking about, too. Stuff from Western media has come up. Western animation, we've definitely talked about Miraculous Ladybug. I was telling Drusilla earlier that there was something I found with Bob's Burgers. And then there's also, Star vs. the Forces of Evil and all of that, which I know you've seen. So.
Well, maybe.
Yeah, we had a huge discussion our last episode 11, about how intense the last 2 episodes of Sailormoon are, and no other episode in the season comes close to being that. And we were discussing how today it feels like animation, or like Gilsey said, Western animation, isn't afraid to go those places, the kind of dark places or mature themes. Whereas in the 90s, I was watching Rugrats, okay? Like, that, you didn't really get a lot of dark stuff back then.
I'm gonna right off the bat dismiss that entire assessment of Rugrats as someone who identified very deeply with animated characters with dead parents. The Mother's Day episode of Rugrats and the exploration of what it's like not to lose a parent, but to live with a lost parent, to discover that you lost a parent, was like really, really powerful and very emotional. Although when you were a kid watching Rugrats, you probably didn't clock that. And that's kind of a really amazing thing about Western animation for children in particular in that period, is that it really started to tackle tough topics in ways that parents would get, but kids would not. But that's off topic here.
No, I think that's very much in topic.
Yeah, and it's also a great example of how I watched that episode and I cared for those characters. I cared for Chucky, but I had both of my parents, so it didn't hit me the same way it hit you. And the same thing from any example is escaping me right now, but something might hit me differently than the way it hits you. Like, the last 2 episodes of Sailor Moon, like, I don't know if John watched them, if he would cry over them the way me and Gilsey did.
You never know.
Yeah.
You never know. But it's interesting that you bring Western animation into it, and I think maybe the best thing I can do for our conversation here is to sort of give a little bit of a survey of how the magical girl trope became what it is. And interestingly, it actually starts in the West. In fact, 2 different aspects of what we consider Sailor Moon's major contributions to animation as a whole, both arguably come from the West. One being the magical girl trope, and the other being the transformation sequence. So we can start with the magical girl trope, which brings us back to 1964, and in fact, it brings us back to live action, believe it or not. Because when Sally the Witch, Mahotsukai Sari is the Japanese name for Sally the Witch, which is a 1966 anime about, oh god, I think it's like, it's a witch, obviously. She's a princess who arrives in the world of humans. She looks like a human, and she brings all her magical powers to this world, and, sort of does all this magic in this world of humans. This is the 60s in anime, and you can imagine that it was kind of a choppy program. Early origins of anime were sort of very cheaply produced, and that's a really long story that we probably won't get into today. But Sally the Witch was influenced by 2 very famous Western media properties of that period, Bewitched and Mary Poppins. So if you look back at the magical girl trope, it's actually probably not that surprising to realize that it all kind of goes back to an American sitcom where a housewife could make magic things happen, and a trio of witches. Is that what Bewitched was? I haven't seen much Bewitched, I'll be honest.
No, only one witch.
One witch.
But
okay.
I think her mother was also a witch, but who, Adora, I think, who would pop in every now and then.
Adora, which is extra interesting considering that we are later going to get to another Adora.
She-Ra!
But then there's Mary Poppins, your magical house nanny. So those 2 shows, well, that movie and that show, both were, Bewitched was cited specifically by the creator of Sally the Witch as like an influence. But Mary Poppins came to Japan in 1965. Like, that's when the dub of Japan of Mary Poppins came. And in 1966, Sally the Witch came out. Bewitched came out around in Japan around the same time as Sally the Witch. So maybe whoever was creating Sally the Witch was watching Bewitched in sub. I'm not sure. And with a lot of this history, because it's so niche, it gets a little hazy. But that was kind of the beginning of magical girl anime. And at that point, it was very literally witches, right? Like, it was rooted in Western conceptions of the witch. There was a few years later, there was another magical girl anime. So the Japanese name for magical girl is Maho Shoujo. So there was another Maho Shoujo in the late 60s called Himutsu no Ako-chan, which is The Secret of Ako-chan. And that is about an ordinary girl who is granted magical powers in reward for a good deed. I'm gonna credit Sugawa Akiko at Nippon.com. I did a lot of research into this topic before this conversation, and she has a really great article about this. So it's worth checking out her article if you're super interested. That is kind of a little more similar to what you eventually see in Sailor Moon. And from there, there's this whole long arc of different shows through the 70s and 80s that eventually lead to Sailor Moon. And a lot of them are with young girl witches. So we end up seeing that kind of coalesce into Kiki's Delivery Service in the 90s, right? You know, that trope kind of moved its way into the Miyazaki side of animation later on. But there were a few shows in the 70s and 80s that really got into this, but that was before, obviously, anime was huge in the States. And I don't want to get too... I could get really, really deep into this, so I'm going to stop for a second and see if you have any questions.
That's really cool that this whole thing of anime started in the West with Bewitched. I actually saw that when I was prepping for this episode, and I always thought it started with the anime Magical Utena. I think that's how you pronounce it. So I was just kind of shocked that the West had any kind of influence on anime at all. But yeah, I also saw that the magical girl trope didn't really exist. It was more of like the fighting stuff for boys. And then from that, it evolved into magical girls fighting girls. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No.
Like, this is all...
I mean, the thing with history, especially of an art form that people are only, really getting into in the past, 30 years in our country, right, is, you can read the documents any way you want. Part of history is creating it while you're assessing it. I think Utena came later, actually. I'm pretty sure Utena came after...
Yeah, it came later.
I'm pretty sure Utena came after Sailor Moon.
Yeah, one of the directors from Sailor Moon is the one who created Utena. Along with a bunch of other people, but he's the name. I'm completely blanking on what his name is. I'm so sorry.
It's Kunihiko Ikuhara.
Yes.
Almost definitely, because I'm pretty sure he was the main force behind Utena. So it took until the 80s until magical girls kind of became magical young women, which is absolutely the start of where you talk about masculine power fantasies and sexualization of magical girls, right? But before that, it was sort of younger witches. And there is another really interesting and important thing to note here, series specifically to note here, which actually doesn't have anything to do with magical girl genre, but does have to do with the shoujo genre and anime made for young girls. And that is Heidi, Girl of the Alps. So Heidi, Girl of the Alps came out in 1974. It was around the same time that Space Battleship Yamato came out, which was the anime in the early to mid 70s for boys in particular. Sort of I think it was a predecessor to Gundam. Very much, it was a space battleship I mean, space battleship is literally in its name. Like, it's absolutely like a sci-fi war anime. And Heidi, Girl of the Alps was very much the opposite. It was about a little girl living in the Swiss Alps. And there's a lot of, again, you can have a conversation here about like Western culture and Japan's fascination with it, specifically after World War II, but before then as well. And Heidi, Girl of the Alps is a really, really interesting series for a couple of reasons. For one, it was directed by Isao Takahata, who was one of the two great creators from Studio Ghibli, along with Hayao Miyazaki. In fact, Hayao Miyazaki also worked with Takahata on this series. So the two of them made it, and you would imagine, being something made by Takahata and Miyazaki, it had extraordinary animation for a television series at all in the 70s that was animated, let alone in Japan. But it also kind of was such a grueling production situation that it gave Miyazaki reason to say, I'm never doing TV again, I'm going to film. But it was very popular among girls in Japan. And we're talking like, so just to like talk a little bit about the production here, because I nerd out on production. Astro Boy's average number of cells per episode were 2,500, right? Heidi's were 8,000. And none of them were reused. Astro Boys were like constantly reused. The 8,000 in Heidi's average episode, on average, were not reused. It was 4 times the quality of Astro Boy, arguably, based on how you determine quality in animation. But it was so much more closely animated, and it's why you could see that with the production schedule, Miyazaki would have been like, screw this, I'm never doing this again. But it made an impact, and it showed that anime was something that young girls were interested in Japan. And so it began to make an argument for the kind of cartoons that would eventually spur on Sailormoon, for one, on one end, and eventually...
Cardcaptor Sakura.
Utena, right?
Yeah, right.
And on the adult end, something like Only Yesterday, which Takahata made in 1991. Or even 10 years later, Miyazaki branching into science fiction with... why am I blanking on it? I'm literally looking at a picture of it on my wall right now. Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind.
Nausicaa.
Right? So that had a big influence too. And then the 80s came. Then there were some shows about... Some magical girl shows. I'm sorry, I'm laughing because one of them is literally called Magical Angel Creamy Mommy. The other one is called Fairy Princess Minky Momo. So we are just like, and then in 1992 you get Sailor Moon.
I mean, Sailor Moon is really big because I think two of the big things that Sailor Moon kind of paved the way for, or at least are very known for, that people pull from, are the transformation sequences. Because that's all over in Miraculous Ladybug. If we have any Miraculous Ladybug listeners, Drusilla.
Yeah.
And even Star versus the Forces of Evil, whenever Star is transforming into her butterfly form, like Steven Universe, whenever there's a transformation sequence with the gems, it's always that bright, really colorful, rainbow-esque, like, silhouette that's happening. And I think that's besides being like the magical girl trope. And then I know we talked about like She-Ra as well with Adora. That is her name. Yes, Adora. And that as well also has a transformation sequence.
So transformation sequences are interesting because they come outside of the magical girl genre. I would be remiss, by the way, if I didn't mention Majoko Megu-chan, Megu the Little Witch from 1974.
Yes.
Which is the first time, I believe, or at least the most, like, the time when people started using the term Majoko, M-A-J-O-K-K-O, as a term for magical girls. Before that, they would use Mahotsukai, which I think is witch, right? Majoko, which is that was the word that they would very often use afterward. Okay, the the transformation sequence. So that's an interesting history too, for a couple of reasons. One being, it's another, and I'm not sure, and I would need to dive a little bit more deeply into this to find out, but I think that it must have existed before this. In fact, I bet
It has to have, right?
I'm Googling right now.
Yeah, because I can't imagine some variation of it didn't exist, even if it was, a Gundam transformation sequence. It's still the same basic principle.
Well, I'm wondering if the first instance of the trope actually comes from the White Snake Enchantress from 1958,
anime,
it's an anime. It was one of the first 3 animated films to be released in America. They released it as Panda and the Magic Serpent here. Oh. And there's a snake that transforms into a princess. And transformation sequences in culture, you're talking basically every mythology has one.
Yeah.
From the Greeks to the ancient Japanese, transformation sequences are not exactly like revolutionary. Girl Utena. But sorry. They're not necessarily revolutionary. I believe that might have been a seminal one, although I'm blanking on... I don't think it's exactly the same way that we see transformation sequence tropes now. The way we see transformation sequence tropes now, arguably, is from He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. Although around the same time in Japan, there was a show called Uchu Keiji, which is usually translated as either Space Cop Gaben or Space Sheriff Gaven, depending on the exact translation, in which there was also a transformation sequence. And not that long after that, so there's a couple of parallels here. He-Man in 1981 and She-Ra in 1985, and you've got transformation sequences in both, and both of those are American shows. In fact, they were produced by Filmation in collaboration with Mattel, because at that point everybody was just making shows to sell toys. He-Man was originally Mattel toys, and then they made him into a show. She-Ra, they spun off from He-Man, and it was a collaboration between Filmation and Mattel. But Filmation, unlike most companies making limited animation in the US in that time, did not use offshore production. They actually made their shows in the US. So it was American animators who were making these transformation sequences, which makes it less complicated in some ways than if they were Japanese animators doing transformation sequences for American companies. At that point, you would wonder, where exactly is this trope coming from? In this case, in animation in the US, it existed in 1981, and Uchu Keiji came out in 1982. Were the Japanese watching He-Man? I don't know. We'd have to look into the distribution, and it gets complicated there. But then after that came Super Sentai, which we in the US call the Power Rangers. And that is another classic transformation sequence which absolutely influenced Sailor Moon. And so when you're looking at transformation sequences, Sailor Moon is a really interesting case, because if you go back and look at the She-Ra transformation sequence, okay, fine, it's a little sexualized because, like, she's a beautiful curvy lady animated in the 80s, and they do the whole sexualized because it was the 80s and it was made for a TV audience and whatever. But the emphasis was still on, like, the physicality of She-Ra. She becomes more physically powerful. When you look at Sailor Moon, the transformation sequence is much more about how beautiful they are and how young they are. There's this sort of sexualization of youth that also in some ways attaches to their increased power once they've transformed, which is sort of an inversion of assumptions about femininity that's very, very interesting.
We've talked so much about the ages, most notably the age differences in the romances that have been happening in Sailor Moon. The big one is obviously the one with Mamoru and Usagi. And that whole part of just the weird sexualization / fetishization of they're literally 14-year-old girls, which is, it's hard to forget sometimes. We do forget sometimes. And whenever that comes up, it's like, oh my God, what are you doing? Why are you, a college student, pursuing a 14-year-old girl. There's something a little skeevy about it.
Yeah, it took this rewatch for me to realize that Mamoru is a piece of garbage.
Yeah. So that whole thing with the sexualization of younger girls is not the greatest thing in the world with Sailor Moon. I think there was also a lot of censorship that happened too. I think you talked about the form of Shira during that transformation, and there apparently when Sailor Moon came to Western audiences, they tried to keep the Western, quote unquote, Western audience in mind because they were trying to do it for younger audiences, and so they like censored the underboob or something, and there's a lot of when they're in the baths they just had to raise the water higher so you couldn't see like the silhouette of the boobs. And then I think there's also they got rid of some of the panty. I can't say it. I can't. Okay, I will say it in my Filipino accent, but the panty shot, even though they're just like leotards. So it's just kind of the whole sexualization of young children. It's a little weird.
We're speaking specifically about, at this point, you're talking about the DIC
yes.
dubbing?
Yes. The dick, yes.
Yeah, so that's... Are you allowed to say that, or does Drusilla have to,
It's usually people call it the Deke dub. I don't know where Gilsey got that.
Is it? Oh,
It's
the
Deke.
Deke dub?
There was a lot of reasons for that dub to be the way that it was. And that adaptation was interesting because, like, to go back, actually, to Super Sentai, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers had just become, like, a huge hit in the US. And I think that was one of the main reasons why Sailor Moon was brought over in the first place, because they saw an audience there and they thought, what if this works? Of course, it did tremendously, in a similar way to Dragon Ball Z, with the exact opposite intended audience, arguably, although, of course, this is where you ask a really hard question. Is Sailor Moon a shonen or a shoujo? Is it actually for young women? Or is it for young men? And I will let the two of you discuss that question, because I think you will have more interesting assessments. But I do think there was a lot of editing in that, in terms of...
There's so much editing.
Oh, the character names, like everything. Like, they changed everything, right?
Character names, the whole, like, sexual orientation of some of the characters.
Oh, yeah. Queerness was just utterly and absolutely erased from the show.
Just... Oh, there's just so much. Like, I think we could make a whole episode about it.
Oh, yeah. I will say, I think the reason... I mean... It's not the only reason a lot of these changes were made, but when Sailor Moon came out in the US, it was directed at a much younger audience than I think it was in Japan.
Guess why?
And so...
Because it was animated.
Nope, because they had a deal with Bandai to make toys.
Oh, it's back to the toy thing again.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and also it was directed toward a younger audience, because it was directed toward an audience that would ask their parents to buy them Sailor Moon toys. Anyway, sorry, Drusilla.
I think it's really fascinating, because I was one of the OG crowd. I watched it as it was coming out, but I also remember not being able to find Sailor Moon stuff anywhere. In order for me to find the manga or anything that was licensed, I could only get it. We would occasionally take like a shopping trip day, and we'd go to a city that was much bigger than my hometown, about an hour and a half away, that had, an enormous mall. They had multiple bookstores. Most of my Sailor Moon stuff has Hot Topic barcodes on it, because that was the only place I could find it.
Hot Topic. Mm-hmm. Oh, man.
And it's so strange to hear about... Oh, well, obviously the primary reason was to sell toys, to sell merch. And as someone who loved Sailor Moon back in the day, I couldn't find that merch. I couldn't ask my parents, oh, please buy me the shirt that I found at Walmart, because there wasn't anything there. And yet now, as we said in the past episode, everyone today is super lucky because if something is really popular, you can find merch for it anywhere because companies have learned the power of licensing and how much money that it makes them.
I would be so cool if I were younger and into anime, because when I was younger and in a middle school full of white people, I'm sorry, but
Why are you apologizing
everyone thought
to
I
us?
was weird.
This is all
Everyone thought
my
I was
fault.
weird. Because they were like, oh, you're Asian, you should like anime, so like why? And then me being self-conscious and like trying to come into my own, I'm just like, just because I'm Asian, I don't like anime that much, as I was hoarding all of this anime stuff. But it's just like, it's nice. It's in a way, it's nice seeing all of this merch and how easily accessible it is. But man, I'd be so cool if I were younger, born in the wrong generation.
Nah, it's true. I've had this same thought. Although obviously for me, it's a very different sort of identification issue, and not to comment on something that's really, it is so ridiculous that is their assessment for so many reasons. One being that it's an assumptive conflation of Filipino culture and Japanese culture, and like, yes, America, both of those countries up, but not in the same way, and they are otherwise like very, very different in terms of their cultures.
So different.
And the idea that Japanese animation is like everybody in Asia's interest. What an absurd. I mean, oh, shocker, white kids were racist when you were when you were in
I
middle
could
school.
go on about all of the things that have happened to me as like an Asian American growing up in a predominantly white suburb.
Yes, I am sure.
Yeah, exactly. And the whole mistaken, I was asked by a past roommate why I didn't just know Japanese because I was Asian. And I was like, yeah, I was like, it doesn't make sense for me to know Japanese because Filipino, like Tagalog, is very heavily based in Spanish. And it would be easier for me to learn Spanish. And she looks at me and she's like, but you're Asian. I was like, excuse me.
Yeah, someone never actually learned anything about colonization in any capacity.
Yeah, I mean the
also,
Japanese.
Like, what?
Go
like,
ahead.
My family's from Europe. Like, should I know Basque? Like, what in the hell is that?
Exactly, and I feel like this is a very common trope when it comes to growing up as Asian American and just knowing, like, being interested in Asian pop culture, and it's just it's like a double-edged sword, you know. I love that everyone knows anime, knows Sailor Moon. I can bring it up in a casual conversation, and it'll immediately click that they will know what it is, and I can like connect with them with it. But on the other hand, y'all, you miss.
I know. I mean, there's another really strange thing about that too, which is, and Emily Yoshida has a really great essay on this. I forget where it was. I think it was at Verge, and I think it came out around the time that everyone was complaining about Scarlett Johansson being cast in Ghost in the Shell, and it dug very deeply into the history of portrayal of characters in anime, and how one would not necessarily assume while watching an anime that its characters are Japanese, because the facial features on a lot of these characters are not necessarily deliberately Japanese. They are often deeply rooted in assumptions of whiteness. Mm-hmm. And although the main character of Ghost in the Shell is, I mean, she's an android, right? But her name is, oh god, what's her last name? It's Motoko, right? Her first
I've never seen Ghost in the Shell, so.
Oh man,
I was definitely there for the discourse that was happening with Scarlett Johansson.
It's Motoko Kusanagi. So the major's name is a very clearly Japanese name, but when
Japanese.
But when you look at the character's face is sort of in some ways it's well, and animation is like everything's stylized, right? So it asks you constantly to wonder about your assumptions based on people's facial recognition, and like, so it's even weirder to me that kids would say that, because kids don't usually have that. I mean, you know, kids parrot their parents, and so the answer here is their parents told them that's Japanese or that's Asian, and their response was, oh, you're Asian, you must, like, because they wouldn't watch Sailor Moon and be like, oh, what a Japanese show. How would they know? How would they know any of the tropes growing up in like some white ass suburb, white as hell suburb? Well, that's even worse. I'm stopping.
It also assumes how you watched or when you watched Sailor Moon too, because when I watched it when I was very young, the first time I watched Sailor Moon was in the Philippines, and I had never seen the first few episodes in English. So I grew up with Sailor Moon in Tagalog because that was what I would watch when I was in the Philippines. And it's really interesting to note that Sailor Moon has touched so many people regardless of culture, because when I was telling Drusilla about how I had come across Sailor Moon, it was very much, despite our culture and like how we grew up, it's still something that we've connected on as well too.
Sure.
And I know like Sailor Moon has obviously been like dubbed in so many different languages. It can't just be Tagalog, but it's kind of, I don't know where I was going with this, but it's reached. What is the word? It has a lot of cross-cultural
universality
things.
Is
There
the
we
word.
go.
You're looking for
Universal?
universality or global appeal.
Universality.
It is. It's got a universality to it. For a lot of reasons. I mean, one being, I did not grow up a femme in any capacity, but I would imagine that in most patriarchal cultures there is a fantasy for women and femmes who want to believe that they can own their body and the power that they have within them and use it for good and have control over themselves in society in general. And like there's a lot of that to almost all magical girl. And of course there's the desire to be special and to be unique and perceived as such, but not otherized for it, which is a also universal thing.
And I think a big draw for Sailor Moon, for Usagi in particular, is that you can be clumsy and not great at school, not great at really anything except Frisbee, and but not only be beautiful, but also get stuff done. You know, you can be badass. You can fight against great evil or small evil. And you can be, women contain multitudes. Like, you can be all of these things. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
Yeah, what's great about Sailor Moon is that there is no set trope for what a girl or woman is. Like, take, for example, even the core Sailor Scouts, right? Ami is this super shy, super bookish nerd. And then there's Makoto, who's super athletic, super tomboy-ish. And Usagi's, one could argue she's the trope that says, I'm the damsel in distress, because she just cries a lot. She's very whiny in the first episode, and you kind of get to see her grow into her own. But it's very nice that Sailor Moon says, look, women are very multifaceted, girls are very multifaceted, but they can still get stuff done. It doesn't matter how they act, it's more of, I guess, their heart.
Which I think makes this whole, which makes the transformation sequence even more interesting, because the transformation sequences for all of these girls is focused so clearly on how they become more beautiful and more like, I mean, beautiful is probably the right word. It's an exaggeration of the sexuality of the teen girl, but also then they take that sexuality and wield it and do powerful, like commit powerful acts and change the world through it. There's lots of ways in which you could go and compare that to mythology. But this is not, I mean, you mentioned Damsel in Distress, Kelsey. This is not Helen of Troy, right? This is not someone who's just like, a beautiful woman waiting for a man to come get her. Like, they are...
Yeah, exactly. Like, Usagi's transformation item is literally a compact mirror in one of these seasons. And a compact mirror is very much a thing of femininity. It's something that's part of makeup, and usually with society, they think makeup is a very feminine thing. And it's nice to see something that, quote unquote, is feminine, is empowered, and it's kind of like weaponized, and it is something that makes them stronger.
Look, this stuff is fascinating. It's really fascinating for a lot of reasons. The way in which Sailor Moon, when we were putting together the 100 sequences that shaped animation on Vulture, we did not include the She-Ra and the She-Ra transformation sequence. We included the Sailor Moon transformation sequence. And I think some people argued it was the wrong call. Sort of the same reason that people argued that including the Cowboy Bebop intro was the wrong call, because the Bebop intro was so rooted in the animations of Saul Bass in the 60s for, like, the James Bond movies, that people were like, that was a pastiche. But the whole show was a pastiche for Cowboy Bebop, and Archer and the Venture Brothers didn't... I think those sequences aped Bebop as much as they aped Saul Bass. In fact, I don't think they would have even thought of the Saul Bass sequences without... Well, Archer, maybe. And I think that's as important for Sailor Moon, too, because when you talk about, like, when we were putting together the Vulture list, and we didn't put the She-Ra transformation sequence in, because the Sailor Moon one really, really cemented it as a trope in later magical girl shows and other anime, while also I don't know, it felt to us when we were talking about it, it was both the quintessential version of it and the most influential, even though there were earlier sequences that it took from. Whoever blurbed it, I forget who it was. I'm sorry, whoever blurbed it. It might have been Amelia Cook of Anime Feminist, but and it might not have been her. I honestly don't remember who wrote this who wrote this piece. The blurb literally mentions that it influenced She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, and honestly, I think it did. She-Ra, Princess of Power's animation, transformation sequence, clearly influenced Sailor Moon. But Sailor Moon's clearly influenced She-Ra and the Princesses of Power's version as much as She-Ra did, the original She-Ra. And isn't that something? We already talked about how it influenced Steven Universe.
Right. But the creator is just such a huge Sailor Moon fan. I mean, even with Steven Universe, there was a cameo of one of the Sailor Moon's manga. I can link it. I'll send you the link so that the viewers can see it. But there's a volume of a Sailor Moon manga in Steven's drawer. And the episode is called House Guest, and it's the first season, episode 27. And it's just really cool how influential Sailor Moon has been. Like, even though it's an older anime, it's popping up in a lot of modern things.
Well, is it an older anime? And then we get into a whole other series of questions here, which is, how do we determine older anime? I mean, the first anime that hit American shores came in 1958. 1958! Think about that. It took another 50 years. 58 to 68, 68 to 78, no, 40 years. 78 to 88, 88 to 98. 40 years for, like, Cowboy Bebop, right? Which I think 39 years for Toonami. So the history of anime hitting the US is fascinating for a lot of reasons. But if you want to talk about really, like, when the anime boom began here, yes, you have to talk about the 90s. And you have to talk about technology, because you specifically have to talk about how before VHS, there was no way to get anime here, aside from whether or not a television network was going to broadcast it. At which point you had to send film. Like, you had to send film So there was a very good reason why in the 80s nobody was sending a ton of anime to the United States to stream to broadcast on television, because you would have had to send copies of the films. Once VHS technology became a thing, and Betamax, RIP, pour out a little liquor for Betamax, it suddenly became a possibility, and it's why you have so many fan dubs in the early 90s, because people could get these VHSs of untranslated Japanese anime and start translating them. In fact, DIC is not the first version of Sailor Moon to hit American shores. AD Vision was. That came in 92. It was VHS. And that was a company that is more famous for bringing Neon Genesis Evangelion.
Right.
But they brought the first 2 seasons of Sailor Moon to the US 3 years before most people watched it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when I was doing prep for the podcast, I read a book called The Incredible Untold Story of Sailor Moon by Shane Black. And, I have thoughts about this book as a, history of Sailor Moon that I won't go into now. But yeah, he talks about how Sailor Moon was in the US and it did not do well. And then right around this time, you started getting these major... He says Pokemon was a huge wake-up call to US TV distributors of oh, hey, these cartoons from Japan actually can sell. They make money. Why don't we try, these? And then that's when you start getting Sailor Moon being relicensed by DiC, them putting out the first 2 seasons. And before we go too far away from the transformation sequence talk, something else that Shane Black says in that book, it was something I never considered before, and I really liked it. How Usagi actually has 2 transformation sequences. You have the one that everyone knows, obviously, Sailor Moon, but she also transforms into the Moon Princess.
That's right. She does. She does.
Mm-hmm. And it's not flashy. Usually it's just, like a crossfade and she's wearing it. But in a weird way, she is arguably more powerful in her princess feminine attire than she is in her warrior.
And there's a whole Japanese history here
sort
that I Japanese mythology history here that I will let somebody else who is not a white dude explain. But that recalls for me. Did any of you watch Tale of the Princess Kaguya, the Isao Takahata anime? So he's another. I mentioned him earlier. He and Miyazaki were the 2 great creators of at Studio Ghibli, and Takahata was in the business way before Miyazaki. Miyazaki got his start working for Takahata, which is interesting because Takahata was not an animator; he was a writer. He worked almost exclusively in animation, but he never drew. He was just very exacting of his animators. So his films are very interesting for that perspective, among others. The Tale of the Princess Kaguya is an adaptation of a very traditional Japanese tale, which is the tale of the bamboo cutter. And it's, for anyone who's listening who doesn't know this tale, basically a bamboo cutter goes into the woods, chops into a piece of bamboo that is glowing, and finds a tiny princess. Grows into a girl, grows into a princess, and eventually she is taken by the court of the Buddha, I think, if I'm remembering this correctly, basically taken to the moon. And she transforms into a moon princess, and her transformation is sort of beautiful and terrible because she loses all her memories and attachments to Earth. She becomes someone else entirely, and her power is rooted in her position as a princess, which is in itself someone with a better knowledge of how Japan perceived royalty than I could probably interpret this more effectively. But I do think that's an interesting parallel.
I think I've seen an adaptation of Kaguya, but I think it was a movie, not a show.
It's a movie.
Okay, then I think I have seen it. It was a long time ago, but yes. I do remember that final scene of her leaving, but also like looking back at her parents and knowing that she's not going to remember them.
It's the opposite, right? She achieves power by becoming the Moon Princess, but actually she's powerless over her fate, which is a very complicated
Which I think,
parallel,
lines up really well with Sailor Moon, because the whole thing is what you're destined for. Like, you can't change your destiny. Like, she loved this guy in a past life, and they're in love in this one. Her friends were her bodyguards, basically, in the past life, and now they're her bodyguards again. She can't just be a normal girl, which is a recurring something that she fights against a lot. She just wants to be a normal girl, but she has this responsibility to protect the silver crystal, and there's no stopping it. She can't just wash her hands of it, because the only thing that will protect her friends, her family, the earth is this crystal, and she's the only one that can use it. And so any other topics that you wanted to dive into?
Well, I think I hit a lot of the stuff that I wanted to talk about. I mean, if you guys have questions for me, you should ask them. God only knows if I have answers. I like I said, I've seen very little Sailor Moon. I think I've said I've seen none. That's not entirely true. I've seen a little bit of Sailor Moon, and I had an ex who would call me Tuxedo Mask sometimes, which made me upset, because I knew he was I knew he was a bad guy.
And the crazy thing is, if this opens up like a whole other can of worms that we can't even get into.
I think it just needs to be a whole episode on its own, honestly, where we talk about the ages and the sexualization of these 14-year-old girls.
But like the idea of manga adaptations into anime, because their age gap is not that drastic in the manga. He is in high school, and they're 2 years apart, maybe 3, but for some reason they made that change in the anime. And I was thinking about how I am not, like, a lot of people don't like the original adaptation of Fullmetal Alchemist. Obviously, like, the manga was still going on when they were making the show, and so it just completely diverges, sort of very similar to what Sailor Moon does. And then some people swear that Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is better because it adapts it a lot more closely. But then
I'm leaving my opinion off. I'm not saying anything.
Oh no.
But see, it's sort of the same thing with Sailor Moon and Sailor Moon Crystal.
Right.
Because the original anime, the 90s anime, is very, very different from the manga, because they were being produced at the same time, and ultimately the anime went off in different directions. It stuck to like a bare outline of what Takeuchi was doing, but with Crystal, they had everything, and so they adapted everything almost exactly as it is in the manga. There are some changes that I think they did for the better, and then there are changes that maybe they changed in regards to the times. Like, I'm specifically thinking of when, in the anime, she gets drunk and passes out, and Tuxedo Common kisses her without her consent. In Crystal, they change it to where she's just sleepy. He still kisses her, but she's not drunk when he does it. But, I think...
We love a post hoc rationalization.
Yeah. But yeah, it's... With Crystal being such a straight adaptation, I don't think... I mean, I think I said in the last episode that people who love Sailor Moon love the 90s anime. That's why they love Sailor Moon. When they talk about Sailor Moon, they're talking about that anime. They're not talking about the manga. They're not talking about Crystal. I think people hate on Crystal so much because they went into it expecting it to be basically the 90s anime, or they were expecting the manga to be closer to the 90s anime, and it really wasn't. Yeah, and it's so interesting because you can see, bringing it all back around, this whole sexualization of young women, because I think I showed Gilsey the comparison between 90s Moon Princess Usagi and
yes, the
Crystal
dress.
Usagi, and it's like she has had a boob job. And the main female villain, her dress is much more revealing, and she has a much more prominent bust. It's so interesting, I guess the, changing with the times, I don't know.
And also with the Sailor Moon crystal, how the girls are drawn, I know they're closer to the manga, but I prefer it as the older version because, I don't know, the way that they're drawn, they're very slender, they're very long and lean, and no one looks like that. Like, I get that they're trying to be as close to the manga as possible, but what I liked about the older, like the 90s version, was that they were drawn less like toothpicks and more closer to what humans actually look like.
They had meat on their bones.
Yes, they had meat.
They were still thin, but they had meat on their bones. And that's why that was a really prominent criticism of Crystal when they did Sailor Moon Eternal. They adapted season 4 into the 2 movies. They brought on one of the original character designers from the 90s Sailor Moon. I'm forgetting their name. I'm so sorry. To do the character designs for this movie.
I think criticism of how the characters are drawn and body shape is really fascinating for me for a variety of reasons. One of which being that Japanese animation often seems like it has more realistic portrayals of body types and shapes than American animation. Not always, but a lot of the great American animation we talk about, not the crappy stuff from the 80s where it's just like action nonsense. A lot of those 80s shows in the US have very sort of, like crazy buff man and crazy... And they're not accurate, but they're at least sort of vaguely rooted in physiology. Japanese shows are a lot more. Japanese animation is closer often to... Aside from the chibi style, anime tends to have a very, not realistic portrayal of, but less iconographical, right? You're not talking about what we now in the US call the Cal Arts style, which means nothing. It doesn't mean anything. We're not even talking about the IPA style, the early limited animation. You're not talking about, like, Fred Flintstone is not an accurate body type either. Gerald McBoing Boing is not an accurate body type. Dexter from Dexter's Laboratory is not an accurate body type. Dee Dee is not an accurate body type.
According to Sailor Moon Crystal, Dee Dee is.
Well, and that's where it gets interesting. But think of American animation, like Nigel Thornberry. Like, not exactly. You're not talking about like someone with a very. His head is his head is half my body size. And maybe that's how Tim Curry's voice sounds when manifested into an animated, like, whatever. But so I think there might almost in some ways be undue criticism to Japanese animation in terms of realistic nature of how a body is characterized. At the same time, Japanese animation has a very similar exaggeration to what we see in some ways in American comic books, where you're talking about massive breasts, massive butts, waists that basically don't exist, and that, in some ways, that's even more complicated, right? You're talking about, that's iconography of sexualization. And yeah, it's fan servicey, often, because there was this pivot from people who watch, and I don't know when this happened, I mean, maybe it was the 80s, when adult animation first started to become a thing, and the 70s in comic books, in the US at least, when after the 60s alt comics movement really pushed things in a darker direction, DC and Marvel kind of pivoted to even darker stories. Not that Marvel wasn't already kind of dark, but they got hornier in the 70s, for sure. And the characters, during the 80s in particular, got way sexier. And at that point, one kind of was prompted to ask, who's reading these comics? Is an outrageously busty Wonder Woman really for, like, 10-year-olds that this comic book was supposed to be for in the 50s? I mean, fine, okay, 10-year-old boys are horny, whatever, but, like, not, like, what? Like, that? Honestly, I was a 10-year-old boy, and I never would have read a comic book specifically to see Wonder Woman half naked. The question of fan service itself is, who are the audiences at this point? And that brings us to an extent back to my question for the two of you earlier that neither of you answered, so I'm putting you on the spot right now. Is it a shonen or a shoujo? Is this show for young women or is this show for young boys? or for like teenage boys. Who is this show for?
See, it's weird because when Sailor Moon does feminism, they do it pretty well. Because, again, back to the conversation of there is no particular type of girl that can be strong. There's a lot of portrayals of women as having different personality types, and they are still strong. But yet, it's like, yes, women empowerment. Yes, there's even an episode where Usagi is trying to make a wedding dress, and her teacher is being married. And it was one of those instances where typically in stories, it's usually the girl that's going after the guy and being weepy, please take me back, blah, blah, blah. But for this episode, the guy was going up to the woman and being like, please take me back, and he brought flowers. And it's something that I don't see as often in media. And it's just, when Sailor Moon does feminism, I think it does it pretty well. But when it comes to the panty shots and the removal of gender things and sexuality, questionable. So I don't know. Can I say it's both? I don't know. Drusilla, what do you think?
I really want to claim it as shoujo, but I think the manga is definitely shoujo because, as we talked about last episode, it's more of a romance that just happens to have magical aspects in it. But the anime is the opposite. It is a magical girl show that just happens to have a little bit of romance in it. However, poorly it's done. I look at shows like Love is War, and my first instinct is, oh, that's a shoujo, because it's like a romantic comedy. But no, it's classified as shonen. And so I think Sailor Moon sits on the fence, but ultimately I would classify it as shoujo, because to me shonen is more action filled, whereas the anime takes a lot of time to focus on the girls and their interactions with themselves and their schoolmates and random people that they meet.
Well, then, wouldn't that also be like slice of life? Like, it wouldn't necessarily be shoujo or shonen?
No, because you still have the magical girl aspect to it, and I don't think I would, like, okay, I may get roasted for this, but there are stakes in Sailor Moon, whereas I think in a lot of slice of life stuff, you don't really have those kind of stakes. Yeah, I think my ultimate opinion is it really sits on the line, but I think I gotta give it to shoujo, because it just feels like there's more attention given to everything that's not the fighting and the transformation. And I'll be the first to admit, I've complained a lot this season that, Usagi is kind of lame when it comes to fighting. And I wish she was a bit more tougher. Mm-hmm. And I wish we saw more tactical stuff from Ami. I wish we saw more of the girls fighting together. Mm-hmm. Having said that, I also think a lot of the reasons why people love this anime so much is because you spend so much time with the girls as girls. Not as Sailor Scouts, but as their civilian selves.
I'm going to challenge a little bit this conception here, Drusilla, specifically because I don't think... Well, let's use an example that you used earlier in this conversation. Let's use Fullmetal Alchemist. I would argue that the vast majority of Fullmetal Alchemist is not fighting, or even adventure. It's the exploration of interpersonal relationships and the unpacking of traumatic experiences and the unraveling of mysteries. In both iterations, right? In both Fullmetal Alchemist and Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, and this is something that we see in a lot of anime, which is a painstaking approach to narrative that involves a whole lot of expository conversation that both ratchets up the tensions between characters while explaining their motivations and how they got there. And I would argue that FMA is a prototypical shonen. Now, I will once again note that I have not seen Sailor Moon. So, I don't... like, don't listen to me. But based on what you just said, that's sort of one of my questions, which is it all that different from a shonen that is more focused on character development than fighting? Like, it's clearly not Dragon Ball Z. Like, we can all agree on this.
Right. I was also going to say, I don't know if any of you have seen Soul Eater, but that's also classified as a shonen, but there's a lot that goes in behind the characters and the motives of why they're in this school. There's even a whole episode about the sword. And I don't know, it feels like Sailor Moon should be both. I know that's such a cop-out answer.
And see, when John said that, my first instinct was to walk back on what I just said and say, oh, well, you don't really see that in Sailor Moon. Because for the most part, every episode stands on its own. And I feel like you don't see a lot of serialization because they were having to balloon out a 13-chapter manga into a 46-episode anime. And I'm not knocking filler, by no means, because the filler is what makes Sailor Moon great, because you have these opportunities to see the girls interacting. But I also think, I'm gonna drop... we also have a TikTok, and I just made a TikTok for our channel at Moon Moment Pod. Find us there. I talked about the Ski Bunny episode in which the girls, specifically Usagi and Rei, end up getting trapped by a monster, and they have this conversation about ultimately them not fighting over Tuxedo Common. And, I said in the TikTok that this is really the first episode where I can see that these girls are really friends. Because I feel like the show tells us stuff a lot, but it doesn't show us. And I think it's just a victim of the, non-serialization of it. And, because, again, shows today are so tight. Shows can be so tight depending on who the audience is for, what platform it's going on. And yeah, my first instinct, I don't know, it's weird, my first instinct was to walk back on what I just said and said, no, they don't have interpersonal relationships, like, you don't see them getting along. But I guess when you put it that way...
to be fair,
but
I'm causing you some trouble. I think it's fairly clearly a shoujo. I think what is a good question here is, in the United States, do those categories matter as much as they do in Japan, right? So in Japan, shoujo are oriented toward young women. 8 to 15, I think, is the general range, and shonen are oriented toward young men, preteens, early teens. Is it relevant in the United States? Does it matter if it's a shoujo in Japan? We would call it that here to honor the way that the Japanese would consider it as a subgenre or as a particular target audience in anime. But that asks some really interesting questions when you talk about the audiences for anime in the United States. Are they very, very different? And I think in a lot of ways they are. A lot of shows that I would assume, or, a lot of shows that are shoujo, like clear, obvious shoujo, the two of you have definitely seen and been interested in, and probably were when you were 14-year-olds. And you were girls at that point.
Oh, hell yeah. When I was younger, I was violent. I was like, yes, let's watch them beat each other up.
Right, 100%. And I loved Anohana. I still love Your Lie in April. I love these shows that are saccharine, beautiful, heartbreaking, preteen dramas. And these are shows that, like, well, Violet Evergarden is fascinating because it's a post-war show, which adds like a whole other level to it. But
gorgeous
animation.
animation.
I love all that. Oh my god, it's so good. It's so good. That's it's Kyoto, right? It's KyoAni.
You would know it more than I do.
Yeah, it's KyoAni. It's a Kyoto animation. I thought so. You can always tell with their style. They also did another magical girl anime, actually, God, what's it called? Sound Euphonium is not the one I'm thinking of, but that's really good. God, what is it? They had a series. It has a girl. She's magical.
You gotta give me more than that if I'm gonna try.
Hold on. The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzuki.
Okay. I didn't like that show either.
I did not like that
What?
show.
Really?
I couldn't stand her.
I
couldn't do
I
it.
couldn't stand
Yeah,
her.
I think I got through like half of the first season, and I was just like gave up because she was just so annoying. I'm so sorry.
I did watch a
it's okay.
fascinating, like 40-minute long video that talked about the Endless Eight. That was fascinating to watch him, but I did not finish the actual anime.
Yeah.
The way that you stream it in the US is different from how
I saw that
how it was broadcast in
there's like
Japan.
there's two different ways to watch it, right? There's the way that it aired in the US, and then there's it like skips around.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird.
Listen, everyone's got their own take on stuff. I think it's great.
But to go back to your question about does it matter in the US, I think it matters only as shorthand, because if you're describing, and obviously it only works for people who are, quote unquote in the know, but if you're describing a show to a friend, hey, I just saw this, it's really cool, it's a shoujo, that gives you this, okay, so I can understand, I have an idea of what to expect. And so I think it only, for us in the US, it only matters as much as a reference point. But, I mean, also, I think questioning whether something falls into a certain category is really important, just because it makes you think about something in, a piece of media in a completely different way.
Oh, I think that's true. I think it's nice for a shorthand, especially among people who love anime. Although, with a show like Sailormoon, it's almost pointless. Specifically, I think, because you're talking about a show that has broken through into the mainstream from anime to the point where my mom has heard of Sailormoon. She doesn't know anything about it, but she knows that it is an anime that has pretty girls in it. That's like enough. So I think in the case of something like Sailor Moon, it almost doesn't matter whether or not it's shoujo or shonen, and then maybe the conversation veers into that, which is, with a show as big as Sailor Moon, is it relevant? How it was conceived in Japan for American audiences, is that relevant? Whereas with a show that is much less well-known here, even if it's a well-known show there, right? Like Paradise Kiss, which is a classic josei at this point. Trying to explain that to someone here, you're never going to try to get someone into Paradise Kiss unless they already know anime but just aren't into josei, at which point you'd be like, well, if you've never seen a josei, let me tell you Paradise Kiss. So I think that's, at some point, it brings us back to the fact that while anime has broken very deeply into American culture in a lot of ways, there are still places where people really don't know. I think it is likely that a lot of people are going to find Cowboy Bebop for the first time through the live-action adaptation, even though that actually makes my blood boil. like literally makes my blood boil. And I'm into it. Whatever. Like, go make that money. I mean,
I'm just thinking of the people that saw like Death Note, and their first thing is the live-action Death Note. Don't watch the live action.
Well, I mean, we all felt the same way when we were watching Crystal every other week. Man, everyone's, there's going to be a whole generation of their first, because at that point, I can't remember if the Viz dub had come out yet, or if it was going to come out soon. There was a whole generation of their first experience of Sailor Moon was Crystal. And you had, besides the not great plot stuff, you also had really crappy looking animation. And I understand there's been discussions about the fact that it was made to stream versus being put on TV and then put on a streaming platform. There's not as much money behind those shows that are made to go directly online, and so that's kind of why it looks so janky in places. What you said about the just general zeitgeist of anime growing, and manga too. You also, you have this 5-10 years ago, you have, like, no one would know what josei is. But now the people who were targeted, it was like, hey, here's a shoujo anime for you to watch, are now old enough to where they can be targeted like, hey, here's a josei to watch. So I think it's just one of those things where you just have to wait. And the audience will grow because they have grown up this idea of anime. And, it's just, over time, it'll grow into it.
Next stop, a Sailor Moon josei.
You know what I want? I want Sailor Uranus and Sailor Saturn. Give that to me.
Neptune.
Would love
Saturn
that.
is 12 years
Neptune,
old.
sorry.
We're talking
Oh my
about
God,
age.
no, not Sailor.
Talking about age.
Please
differences.
Ooh, Gilsey just self-canceled. If
Oh no!
I thought that if anyone was going to cancel themselves on this chat, it would be the white man among the three of us. But
No.
Gilsey, you just did some work right there, girl.
All right, I do not ship them together. Sailor Neptune and Sailor Uranus. I want something of those two because they don't have enough screen time together, at least I don't think. And I also would love to have more of Makoto and her. I'm just a big fan of Makoto and am in love with her, so I would like that too, aged up.
I mean, there's so much opportunity to do more in the Sailor Moon universe, but I mean, if you're as rich as Takeuchi is, you don't need to. All right, I mean, we've covered a lot of ground.
I hope so, because I don't know anything else about anything at all. Actually, I've expended everything even remotely resembling.
No, it's really fascinating to think that. I mean, it's kind of sad almost to think that in a weird way Disney is partially responsible for magical girl genre, as if they don't have enough IPs under their control now. Although I did do a TikTok where I talked about how the Walt Disney Corporation owned the English rights to Sailor Moon for a very brief time.
I will say that it is worth noting that just because Disney had a property that influenced the genre, I don't think Disney gets to claim the magical girl.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, there's a lot of things that Disney can claim, for sure. And, of course, the magical girl genre has a very deep root in any kind of folklore, which Disney mined as much as it possibly could.
Yeah.
For reasons that are worth exploring in another podcast. But I don't think Disney gets to claim this one. You want to talk about how the young women protagonists of Disney made all of animation have a focus on young girl and young woman protagonists in a certain sense for a certain type of story. I think it's sort of inevitable that in some ways Disney was going to have an influence on it. But when we talk about these anime, we're not talking about anime that are indebted to Disney. In fact, I can't imagine a Disney movie of the same era as Sailor Moon in which the heroine wielded a weapon and fought evil herself. Think about the movies that came out at the same time that Sailor Moon... 1992, right? 1992 Disney movies.
I think Aladdin came out in 1992.
Aladdin came out in 1992. It was still a movie in which Jasmine's predominant power was seducing Jafar. Fake seducing Jafar. You can't even compare it. Like, I don't think Disney would have even tried. Belle's power, Ariel's power, they were still fundamentally stereotypically feminine, conversational, convincing people of things, having that starry-eyed wish to see something bigger than what they wanted. I don't think Disney could have even tried. Like, I don't think it would have conceived of the possibility. Disney had an easier time doing that with animal characters than it did with actual young women. And I would have to look to see if there were any young women animal characters that Disney did. Disney animators went off and made their own movies with, like, The Secret of Nim, Mrs. Brisby. That was a tough, enterprising female lead. But...
No, Disney gets a lot.
No, Disney doesn't get this one. They're not allowed to have Sailor Moon.
No, I'm on board. I don't want to give Disney Sailor Moon.
Yeah. Boo.
Yeah. Get out of here. They're not allowed. They didn't distribute it. They didn't create it. They don't get credit for it, even with the Mary Poppins angle. Forget it. No chance. They have enough.
Yeah.
Bob Iger has enough. My God.
I think, would that wrap up our episode?
No, we can't leave it with Bob Iger. We gotta say something else.
Okay, really quick, something that I wanted to say in our last episode, but did not have a chance, that if you are familiar with the Deke version, you know that when Sailor Moon goes to fight Beryl, a very kick-butt song called Carry On comes on. It is very iconic. However, during the original Japanese, obviously does not have that song. I was shocked because I did not remember this. The song that plays over her fight with Beryl is the theme song to Sailor Moon. And there is something about that song being there. I thought I was done crying, and then that song came on, and it just, for some reason, it just hits differently. And, it just got me thinking, like, I've talked, I won't go into all of it here because I've talked a lot about the sound design and the music for the Japanese version versus the dub. Music and sound design isn't something I think about a lot in anime. And it's the same thing sort of with just movies in general. I may occasionally notice a score or two, but for the most part, I don't. But this rewatch, something just clicked, and so many things stood out. Again, you'll never take Carry On away from me, but something about having the theme playing while Sailor Moon fights Beryl for the last time, and spoiler alert, dies doing it. It's just, there's something so powerful about that.
A lot of crying.
I cried again.
They're important. Music cues are truly very important. And so it's like midnight, girl. Why'd you just bring
I guess
up
this
music
just means
cues
you
like
have to go back to
for
the show.
hours? Oh, we should have just ended with Bob Iger. Yeah, I love to like watch a couple of representative examples of Sailor Moon and listen to the soundtrack, like hear how it works, but I ain't got
All right,
it.
so I guess this
Not
wraps
tonight.
up our episode. Look forward to the second season beginning in November. We will start with episodes 47 through 50. Check out our social media on Twitter and Instagram at Moon Moment Pod. Don't forget to check out our website at moodmomentpodcast.com. There you'll find show notes and transcripts of every episode.
So John, where can people find you online if they want to start following you and hear more rants, digressions, everything about anime and animation?
I don't want to be found. Don't find me.
Okay.
My Twitter handle is my name, at John H. Maher, Maher. My newsletter that I am really not writing at all these days and really have to finish my next iteration of is Tears for Tunes. You can find it on Letter Drop, but it deals with animation and childhood trauma principally, of which there's a whole lot in animation. And I write pretty regularly for Vulture and occasionally for Polygon about animation, so you'll find me around. Twitter's probably the best bet, though.
And tell people, I'm blanking on the exact name of the article. I'm so sorry. Your 100 Years of Animation award.
Yeah. Oh, God,
I'll put that in the show notes, but everyone should check that out. It is pretty amazing.
Sometimes John Maher can do things.
You're sweet. Yeah. So my best friend Eric Phillips-Boas and I ran a website called The Dot and Line for 5 years, where we covered animation sort of from a fan perspective, and it got us enough attention for Vulture to ask us to write this piece. I'll ask him, and he told him he wouldn't do it without me, which is very sweet. It's called The 100 Sequences That Shaped Animation, and it is a history of animation from an American perspective. So there's a lot of Japanese stuff there, but it's focused on American animation and what influenced American animation rather than like a global perspective. Although we tried to. Anyway, The 100 Sequences That Shaped Animation. It's a long list on Vulture. In my opinion, it's one of the best resources you can go to really kind of understand the history of animation. We start in 1892, we end in 2019, and there are clips for every single sequence. So, unlike a book, and I love books, but you can watch the sequences. And with animation, which is such a visual art form, I think it's really important to be able to access them. That's on vulture.com, the 100 Sequences That Shaped Animation. I hope you like it.
As I was reading it and I got closer and closer to the 1990s, I was like, is John Maher going to have Sailor Moon on here? If not, we might have to throw down. And Sailor Moon is on that list, ladies and gentlemen. So yeah, let us know what you thought of this episode. We'd love to hear your Moon Moment musings. And you might just get a shout out like earlier in the episode. Obviously, if you'd like to support the podcast, please rate, review, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. It helps Moon Moment stay afloat amidst the vast oceans of podcasts. I'm Drusilla.
And I'm Gilsey. Until next time, we'll be back, Moon.
We'll be back.
Oh.
That was terrible.